Welcome. I am Laura Nelson, President and CEO of the National Cryptologic Foundation, or NCF. This is the second special virtual program we are hosting to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the foundation. For those of you not familiar with the National Cryptologic Foundation, we were incorporated 25 years ago as the National Cryptologic Museum Foundation. While we were originally incorporated to support activities, displays, and artifact acquisition for the National Cryptologic Museum, over the years, our mission has broadened to include a robust education program and a capital campaign to build the Cyber Center for Education and Innovation. Today, we are honored to have our guests, three former principal deputy directors of national intelligence, all of whom I had the pleasure in working with or for during my own years at NSA. Thank you for being with us today. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Dell Technologies, Tower Federal Credit Union, and GIBA, the Government Employees Benefits Association. Now introduce our speakers. Mike Hayden is a retired four-star general, United States Air Force, who served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 2006 to 2009 and the National Security Agency from 1998 to 2005. He was also the country's first principal deputy director of national intelligence from 2005 to 2006 and the highest ranking military intelligence officer in the country at that time. In all of these jobs, he worked to put a human face on American intelligence, explaining to the American people the role of espionage in protecting both American security and liberty. Since his retirement from public service, General Hayden served as a university visiting professor at Oxford University, has authored 2 New York Times bestsellers, founded the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence Policy and International Security at George Mason University, and is a principal advisor at the Chertoff Group, and has been the recipient of many distinguished intelligence awards. Dr. Donald Kerr served as the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence from October 2007 through January 2009. Additionally, he was the 15th Director of the National Reconnaissance Office and concurrently served as the Assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force for Intelligence, Space Technology. He served in other leadership roles within the CIA as the Deputy Director of Science and Technology, as well as the FBI and Department of Energy. Currently, Dr. Kerr serves as the chairman of the Board of Trustees of Myre and is also a director of Michael Baker International, LLC, and Orbis Operations, LLC. Ms. Stephanie O'Sullivan served as the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence from February 2011 through January 2017. She focused on the operations of the ODNI and the intelligence community, as well as IC integration initiatives and resource challenges. Her prior assignments include the Associate Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, with emphasis on day-to-day management of the organization, as well as the CIA Deputy Director of Science and Technology. Since her retirement in 2017, Stephanie has served on a number of corporate and advisory boards, charitable foundations, and academic organizations, continuing to focus on national security, research, and STEM education. Our moderator for today's program is Greg Myre, the National Security Correspondent for National Public Radio, with a focus on the intelligence community. Greg was able to moderate our first virtual 25th anniversary program we held earlier this year, and we thank you, Greg, for moderating our program today. I'll let you begin this conversation.
Thank you, Laura. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here again with such a wonderful panel. We will jump right in, and I'll just note that we're gonna talk till about 11 o'clock or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. We've had some questions submitted in advance, and we'll also, I believe there's a way for you to submit questions, and we'll include some of those. So think about what you want to ask our panelists, things that I may miss. So please get ready. General Hayden, I would love to start with you. And since we've just marked the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, you were head of the NSA on 9/11. Can you tell us what it was like to be at Fort Meade on that day? What was your experience?
Yes, indeed. First of all, I've got to say something about aphasia. So sometimes it's very hard for me to say something. So if you have a problem, I'm really sorry, but I want to talk to you anyway, okay? So I was there on Monday, it was Tuesday morning, you know? I was there late at night before because I had Denver was playing, and I was I was looking at that, and then I was tired. And I went in and did it. First of all, I did I talked to people, okay, and it was okay. And then something happened. My friend came in and said, "There's something going on in New York." Okay, well, tell me about it later. And then the next plane hit, and then it realized that was I knew exactly what was going on. Okay, it was Al Qaeda. About three hours later, George called me and said, "What do you have?" And I said, "It's Al Qaeda. It's Al Qaeda. It's Al Qaeda." And after that, well, we did a lot of things until our retirement. Yes.
Right, and if I just follow up just a bit on that,
Yes.
the sense immediately that it was Al Qaeda, was that because of any intelligence streams that had been coming in the days and weeks prior, just a gut instinct, or how did you know so quickly?
Both of them. Okay, we know on the summer that was going on. There's something going on, and we were saying something about this, but we didn't know where. Okay, and then it was, and then like I said, I called. I'm sorry. There we go. I called. I talked to George and said, "It's Al Qaeda. I can see it now."
And I believe, if I recall correctly, that a lot of people a lot of people were then sent home. You kept a core staff there that day, but a lot of people left. And what was it like trying to get operate under those conditions?
Yeah, it was about a third. They stayed, and after that they left. Okay, so about a third stayed. Okay, and it was okay. We could do that.
So, Stephanie, I know you and Don were both at the CIA that day. So could you talk a little bit about that? Stephanie, why don't you go first? Tell us what your 9/11 day was like.
Well, I was a much more junior officer than Don and General Hayden at that time. And I was standing outside waiting to catch the van to go down to the Hill, where we were going to meet with some members and some staffers in the Senate. And we got the news as we were standing out there chatting with each other about what an absolutely stunningly beautiful morning it was, that a plane had hit one of the towers. And the hope, which we were clinging to at that point, was that it was a horrid accident. And we got in the van, we started heading down the parkway, and we got the news that a second plane had struck the second tower, at which point you knew it was deliberate. There wasn't any place to turn around. We attempted to call the Senate and confirm that we did need to come down there. It was chaos in the Senate. As we rounded the corner, we saw smoke coming up from the direction of the Pentagon. And after that, it was gridlock. The entire city was locked. It took us about 4 hours to turn around and get back to CIA headquarters, at which time, as we all recall, nobody had access to phones because the cell phones were all jammed up. So you couldn't call anyone and tell them where you were and that you were okay. And then we got back to the agency headquarters and we were basically sent home. And then the next day started with, as horrible as that was, that whole night you were spending there thinking about, did we miss something? Could we have done something about this? And just playing over and over in your head all those innocent people just going to work in the morning. So I still have trouble talking about it. Anyway, and after that, we started the phase of the intelligence community of the CT fight. And what could we do? And we were really starting from what felt, despite all the pieces that we had, compared to what we assembled over the next decade in understanding where Al Qaeda was, and what they were doing, and their network. Looking back, we were starting almost from zero, it felt like.
Mhm, mhm. And Stephanie, just not to recall that the fourth plane, the one that went down in Pennsylvania, it's
Right.
widely believed that that the Capitol was the target. So you would have been literally on a collision course with that fourth plane
That
at that
didn't
time. And were
strike me.
were you just stuck right on the parkway there in terms of getting turned around and trying to get back
No,
to the CIA
we
headquarters?
made it over the bridge, and we're heading toward the Senate. Turned around. I don't think that struck us. The fourth plane, what struck everyone was the grief and the sense of pride in the bravery of the people on board. So that was stunning.
Mhm, mhm. And Don, you also were at CIA headquarters on that day. Can you tell us a little bit about your day and how that played out?
Well, originally I was supposed to be in Tyson's for a breakfast meeting, but really didn't make it there, and was back at CIA in time to see the second aircraft strike. In my office at that time, or our outer office actually, was Kurt Lippold, the former skipper of the USS Cole. And he watched that and immediately just turned and left the building. No surprise. As Stephanie pointed out, there was a certain amount of disarray because not only did we not know where the fourth plane was going, there were some who believed that CIA itself might be a target. So the headquarters building was actually evacuated, and you had a lot of senior intelligence officers milling around in the parking lot, ultimately using the one secure phone available in the printing plant. It was a difficult time to decide how many people should stay at their post in the building if there were a danger, what they could accomplish in communications with their colleagues elsewhere in the community, and most importantly for George Tenet, how to maintain continuous contact with the White House, which of course was interested in anything anyone knew at the time. So it was a revelation in behaviors, a revelation and revolution in the conduct of our business. I should say that immediately after the next day, Stephanie and I had the privilege of talking to an awful lot of our recently retired senior officers, many of whom volunteered to come back with no negotiation about how they would be compensated, but to help with training, planning, and all the things they could do to augment the present staff. So that was a wonderful situation because you could learn a lot and do a lot because you had more arms and legs.
Right. And just to pick up on that. So on 9/11 itself, where obviously cell phones were down, were landline phones, were computers down in the office as well, or were they still functioning?
There were none in the parking lot.
Okay. General Hayden, we've been talking so much about Afghanistan these past couple weeks. Could you maybe just talk about over the years how you were thinking, how your own analysis and thinking of Afghanistan evolved, what you sort of anticipated might play out over time? Just give us some sense about what you were thinking as the years passed in Afghanistan.
Yes, indeed. So I've been in Afghanistan. I was there 4 or 5 times. Okay. And I like the people really much. Okay. I like the people. And then what happened today was very sad. I thought I think we should have done more, and we should have stayed there. Okay. So the president did it. I know he has the power to do that, but if I was telling him, I would say, let's not do it yet. Let's just wait and see. Okay. And so I was very sad that it was happening.
So, I mean, the past 2 decades of war have certainly not gone as planned, to say the least,
Right.
in many ways. But do you think at this point the U.S. had found, in a sense, some sort of sweet spot in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, maybe, where a small U.S. presence with air capabilities, intelligence capabilities, advising and training capabilities, not involved in day-to-day combat operations, but that small force of 2,500 or whatever it might be could have an outsized impact. And that, you know, while the force was pulled out of Afghanistan, it remains in Iraq. A small U.S. force still remains in northern Syria. That's not creating a lot of political turmoil here. Did you feel that they sort of found a way to be present and active while limiting the risk?
That is exactly correct. Okay. And I thought we could do that for a long time. You know, I was there 2 times in South Korea, okay, for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, okay, and we've done that a lot, and it was okay. In Germany, the same thing. So we could have done that, and then maybe later on, maybe the president wanted to go. I know that, and for years and years. He did that, and it's a hard problem, you know. It's a really hard problem. But I would have stayed. I would have stayed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Greg, one thing
please,
I
Don.
want to add to what Mike just said. We have people wringing their hands about the end of the 20-year war. One thing you might want to think about is 21-year wars. On the military side, most of the people served 1 year tours of duty, and they weren't consecutive. It was only on the intelligence side that you had people doing 3 and 4 year tours in country with appropriate language training, the time to make the contacts and get information from them because they were trusted, which is a very different situation. So you have to be careful about how it's talked about in public today.
Right. It's definitely, Stephanie, let me pick up on that as well. The U.S. military is gone from Afghanistan, but the intelligence agencies are also have greatly diminished, if not gone. But their job hasn't changed. The military is no longer, doing the things it was doing for 20 years, but the intelligence agencies are still expected to keep up. Is Al-Qaeda reconstituting? What is ISIS-K up to? Are foreign jihadis coming into Afghanistan? Could you talk a little bit about the way that the intelligence community mission really hasn't changed, but obviously they're trying to do that job with many fewer resources?
Yeah, it will be harder. This over the horizon concept is difficult. The military being on the ground gave you a lot of presence on the ground. So there's a lot of indicators of what was going on, and you don't have to call it intelligence. There's just awareness of what was going on across the country. So it's going to be much more difficult. And it was never an easy job. Intelligence is never going to solve the underlying policy problem on its own. We inform it. I often felt like we were fingers in the dike. You're trying to hold back the crisis or warn or prevent of something, but you're not the solution to it. So it's a holding action, and it's a more difficult one now.
It's
Right.
very, very interesting. My counterpart later became the vice president of Afghanistan. Okay. And he was very, very good. Now he's on the north, he's still going on, okay? It's sad for him. It is very sad because we were hoping we were doing something right, and now we're not doing it much at all.
And General Hayden, President Biden was Vice President Biden back in 2011 when the U.S. pulled out of Iraq at that time. In fact, he was deeply involved in that withdrawal. Did it surprise you that he went ahead and did the Afghanistan pullout, having been so deeply involved in 2011 when the U.S. pulled out of Iraq, and then within a year or two, ISIS started to emerge as a real power there? And so did you expect perhaps a different approach this time now that he's the commander in chief?
Yeah, I'm afraid not. And by the way, it was a problem for the president also. You know, what can I do? What can I do? Okay, so it was hard, but I would say, Mr. President, there's a lot going on in the United States. Let's do that first, and maybe we'll talk about Afghanistan much later on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think there's another thing that one might bring up. There were a lot of people who, when we were first in Afghanistan and started to understand the culture better, we were not in a nation building mode at that point. The real problem was nation building for us became how to make them behave like we'd behave. And we forgot about things like the Loya Jirga, when there was a decision to be made amongst communities. The Afghans would maybe have 100 people meeting until exhausted to come up with a solution. That's a different way of doing it than we do. But it could have been foretold had they taken the time to read Winston Churchill's book from a century earlier, since he, as a young person, was in Afghanistan as the British tried to pacify it in their model. So there's ample experience that white Anglo-Saxon people don't understand how to interact with these tribal communities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Stephanie, we've heard a lot of finger pointing and accusations over the past month, often saying this was an intelligence failure. And certainly the intelligence, current and former people that I've been able to speak with have said, well, we were suggesting that the Afghan government and the military was not in a great position. The Taliban were growing stronger. And whenever this happens, it's very easy for policymakers to blame the intelligence community, and the intelligence people can't come out and say, well, here's the classified intelligence. I told you so. Go ahead, General Hayden, you jump in first.
Oh no, really? Oh my God. Okay.
It comes with the territory. General Clapper used to say that there's two states of being: intelligence failure and policy success, or policy success. You just have to learn to deal with it as an intelligence officer. It's not. We can't defend ourselves because you have to reveal things you cannot. So you can't, as the saying goes, talk about the successes or the progress, because you don't want to set it back. And it's easy to point fingers. The advice that I'm following at the moment, that I followed for a lot of my career, came from General Hayden, which is that when you're sitting at that table as the intelligence officer, you give the input, you try to make it clear, and you try to make sure that you're heard. But once it switches to policy mode, you kind of figuratively push back from the table. That I often felt as we were briefing the policymakers and at the NSC or principal committee meetings or in the Oval Office, that as hard as we thought our job was, we would take this giant mess of trouble and all the things and all the bad news in the world. And then it was sort of like, over to you guys to fix this mess. So I do feel that our job was often quite hard, but we didn't have the job of fixing it.
So let me follow up on that, and I'll direct this to Stephanie, but I'd like to hear from all of you. So in this kind of situation, what can we reasonably expect from the intelligence community? Should it have been very clear how weak the Afghan government and the military was, and what could potentially happen? But how fair or unfair is it to say they're going to collapse in 11 days or 1 year or 3 years? What is fair in terms of the assessments that were being made, and what is unfair in your view?
Well, it all depends upon what kind of intel they had. And I wasn't reading this stream of intelligence coming in through the summer and the spring. I do think it was widely acknowledged that it was rather weak, and you only had to look at a map and look at where the Taliban were. We were holding the cities, and that is not a nation government. Now, the question really would be fall of Kabul, and that, excuse me, that's entirely dependent on what kind of the stream of intelligence and specifics were. So I am quite sure that if we had a lot of specific and very detailed and highly confident information, that would have been conveyed. Once you get to the where it's ambiguous, you're sort of at the challenge of it's up to the interpretation of the listener, and it leaves them room to interpret confidence or not in the direction they wish, which is sort of the art form of an intelligence officer, which is making it clear, and then you decide at the point where you push back. So, sorry.
Yeah.
Wasn't in the room.
Don or General Hayden? Yeah, go ahead.
Having also served as a senior at the FBI, I'm taken by the difference between law enforcement and intelligence. Law enforcement is the study of history. The facts and evidence exist. If you're lucky enough to find them, dig them out, and understand them, you can tell people an awful lot. On the intelligence side, what you're really doing with a meager helping of facts in some cases, speculation in others, is predicting what may happen, what may evolve. The margin of error is much larger, but the people on the receiving end often don't understand that, and the public certainly does not. And the consequence is that it's very easy to look at the intelligence community behavior, pick up failures or the inability to predict, but if they're built into the very system that generates intelligence.
Yes, indeed. I was there 2 or 3 years at CIA, and I was many meetings on Afghanistan. Okay, there was one meeting, everybody was saying, well, it's hard, but it'll be okay, it'll be okay, it'll be okay. So I walked out and I talked to Steve Hadley, just talking about him, and said, Steve, we don't see that way. We don't see that at all. Okay, and he looked at me and said, okay, thank you, but everybody else was saying, oh, it'll be okay, it'll be okay. And CIA said, not so fast at all, not so fast at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Reminded a little bit of what the investor Warren Buffett would often say, which is, or still says, it's like, I can tell you where the stock market's going to be in 10 years. It's going to be higher, but I can't tell you if it's going to go up or down today. That's impossible to say. Don, I want to pick up on something you mentioned about your time in the FBI. Not only were you in the FBI, but you were involved, as I understand, in a couple of very important investigations, I believe, including the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. Could you talk a little more about approaching that as an FBI investigator versus how you would look at that from an intelligence perspective?
Well, it's certainly true that I was involved in the investigations in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Those were the two embassies that were blown up. My people were supposed to be gathering evidence and did so, including things that led to the identification of some of the perpetrators. They also ended up being the ones to recover remains of US casualties because they were the only people there who really were prepared to do that. Those followed on the original World Trade Center attack that, of course, was unsuccessful. So you had those three, and then the USS Cole in Aden. And the FBI side was more and more convinced that these things were linked in ways we didn't understand well. But it was very hard to get people out of the mode of dealing with one crime at a time. There were people in the US government who were beginning to think about this. One I would point out was John Hamre at the Department of Defense, who came over to the FBI and got Bob Mueller involved heavily, talking to him, came to CIA and talked to George Tenet and talked to me. And we started informally trying to think about how the United States government and the entities we all represented could work together better. It became quite clear to some of us that the legislation of 1947 and 1952 that might be called the foundations for both the CIA and the NSA were still helpful, but insufficient to the current needs. And there was at that point no emphasis on trying to bring things together. That really took 9/11 to do it, but there were stirrings already that we could do a better job. And I would argue 20 years after 9/11, there should be stirrings about how it could be further improved. We have some strange structures within the intelligence community. They're historical in nature. They've become habits for the people who perform the tasks, but they don't really address the question of the mix of capabilities that we need. And in fact, there's a bias towards technical collection when what we really need to do is get into the hearts and minds of the people who will be our adversaries. And that's not pure technical collection at all. So some rethinking as a consequence of the 20-year anniversary would be a good idea too.
So Stephanie, let's expand on that a little bit. So I know you and Don and General Hayden have all had the job of Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. And I've just learned very recently, thanks to you, that job had a nickname because that's a mouthful to say, good morning, Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Tell us a little bit about that and then we'll dig in.
Okay, saying PDDD&I was a mouthful. So I referred to it as P. Diddy, and that's what they used around the office. And I think that was a mark of how much progress had been made since the office stood up. When they were first standing it up, they had to fight just to prove that they could exist and fight for their own authorities, right? And they'd won all those battles. And then there was the ones that should have been won. And then there was the whole period when the office went through prove your value, constant challenges about how many people were in it and everybody forgetting that most of it was directed. So it was very hard. By the time we were there, Clapper and I, it really was what Don mentioned earlier. It was about trying to learn the lessons that we'd been applying in the field and in the CT fight, of integrating the enterprise and being more than the parts. And frankly, as we turn to a great power competition, that's even more the case. If we cannot win this in our own corners, we cannot overcome the threats that we face. So we were focused more than anything else in trying to get everybody to work together. And if being P. Diddy was the way to do that, which often felt like being a room mother, slightly encouraging people to cooperate and influencing people to cooperate and doing we're in this together. There were times when I felt like I should hold up a picture of UBL and say, enemy, not enemy. We're on the same team here. So there was a lot of encouraging and influencing.
Well, of course, that nickname begs the question, did you ever deliver a classified briefing in rap lyrics?
I did not, because I would have been called out on it immediately by people who were much more knowledgeable than me.
Got it. General Hayden, so let's make the turn to something that Stephanie has just mentioned about going to great power rivalry, which is clearly what we're talking about now. But did this past 20 years was such a heavy emphasis on counterterrorism, on Afghanistan and Iraq and a few other places in the Middle East. Did this distract the U.S. from other things? And not that one thing is all important and the other issues are not important, but did it take away too much time, too much energy, too much bandwidth in terms of looking at the threat of a rising China, the cyber challenges that we face? And are we prepared to make that turn now, do you think?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. That's exactly correct. That's it. Okay. We did a lot of things. Okay. I was there almost 3 years at NSA. Okay. And I every day I'd said, I got to get some people involved in this and on this and on this. And at the end of the day, I said, well, I didn't do it today, but maybe tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And we didn't, because everything was on Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda. And I know that was happening. And I tried to do things differently, but most of the time I couldn't. Okay, there was so much to do.
So I've heard you say in the past, a couple speeches a couple of years ago, you talked about the way you recall a time when the world was more dangerous, but it's never been more complicated. Is that still a way of thinking you would adhere to and maybe expand on that?
Yes, indeed. That's exactly correct. For the current director, he called me right before his confirmation. Okay, and I talked with him and I said, well, think about three things, okay? It's China, of course, and then it's China, of course, and then the third thing is it's China, okay? But there's more to that than that, okay? And we have to do more. And on the first, second, or third month of this recent conflagration, we wanted to talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. But there's a lot going on, not Afghanistan at all. And we've got to do that. And it was hard. It was very hard, but we have to do it many times.
And Greg, I think there's a missed opportunity embedded in what Mike just said too. At the end of the Great Leap Forward, when China had a terrible situation in terms of education, trained people, and the like, the United States was very open in our universities and elsewhere to educate Chinese people. For example, the head of Fudan University whose own PhD came from MIT. She came to this country asking for help from various universities. So we had very good relationships that grew out of that era because of students who had been trained here, collaborated with people here even after they went back to China. And there's been a hardening of the arteries ever since. There isn't that open feeling about technology and science anymore. At the same time, you have the rising competitiveness of China in terms of industry, and they've become de facto the supplier to the world in many different areas. And we have lost the ability to deal with that, except company by company. But as the government, I don't think we're in the game at all.
Okay, so you've raised a very important point, and I'd like to have address a question to you, but have all of you answer it as well. So I believe until the pandemic hit, or until a couple of years ago, there were, I think, something in the order of 350,000 Chinese students, undergrads, graduate students in the US at a given time. Can the US, is that a net benefit to the US, or is the risk of intellectual property theft, of research theft too high? Can the US incorporate that many Chinese students, many of them involved in STEM fields? Many of them would love to stay and work in the US. Is that a net benefit, having those folks come here, study, many stay, at least go back with some US values and education in their pocket? Or is the risk of theft that we've seen over the years too high? How would you break that down in your mind? What would you judge to be a net benefit for the US, and what a net loss?
Well, when I was a graduate student, one of the four of us in the office was a Chinese student. So I was introduced early on. Here in Colorado, the University of Colorado at Boulder has had a number of Chinese students in very important areas. There's a company, a startup called Cold Quanta. The faculty member who started the company has had many Chinese students. Now he's unable to communicate to them fully anymore. And of course, in recent years, they've not been welcome to stay after they've completed their degrees the way they used to be. So in effect, the US, through its either thoughtful policies or inadvertent policy behaviors, has closed the door on those open relationships. I'm not sure that they could be rekindled at this point, given the way in which the two governments are posturing at the present time. But it might be something to look forward to in the future, should people change.
Stephanie, would you want to pick up on that?
Well, I think Don put it very well of where we are right now. And we've gained immensely from the openness that we had in the past. I hope we can get back to that. But in reality, it is not an either or choice. We need to find a way in the middle, which says that you acknowledge that there's risks and you do reasonable things to counter the risk. And you don't go all the way to shutting the door, and you don't go all the way to naively believing that everybody is here for the good. That is an unsatisfying middle way. That is the American way. So.
General Hayden, related to that, the discussion in Washington, if it's the intelligence community, national security community, the politicians in Washington, China is a security threat, and that's pretty much point 1, 2, and 3. If you go outside of the Beltway and you go to Silicon Valley, or you go to talk to soybean farmers in the Midwest, or you talk to Wall Street investors, or you talk to small towns that may have a Chinese investment, many of them still see China as an opportunity. Can we develop a national policy and strategy for dealing with China when you have some people in Washington saying China's a threat, and other people saying, no, China's a business opportunity?
That's exactly correct. Okay, it's both. It's both. And when we have to decide, okay, I think when I look at this next, 100 years, this is the main problem. What about China and the United States? Okay, and we have to do more to do something about it. So we have a problem for intelligence, yes, but many things we were doing with China would be very good. So let's try to do that as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think to ride on, oh, sorry, Stephanie, go ahead.
Oh, okay. When we first were doing the pivot to Asia, the China prevailing philosophy had been hide and buy, right? In the previous times, they were gathering capability and rebuilding and focusing internally, but that was changing, and it particularly has changed under Xi. And so the biggest question that I kept asking my briefers every morning, and it felt like I asked it every morning, was what does an assertive, aggressive China look like? What is their model? And how is that going to play out? And that's the transition we're in now, where we have a much more assertive China. You see that in the South China Sea. You see it in the way that they're reaching out around the world, and you see it in the way that they are looking to fill the spaces that we have left while we debate the best way forward ourselves. So I think that I would challenge your posit just a little bit, in that I don't think that it's as clear in the business community or Silicon Valley these days that it's all upside and no downside. They've been burned for reasons have nothing to do with national security necessarily or DC policy. It just hasn't, the dollars and cents and the markets are not as simple as they thought. So I think that there's a bit of change. We're seeing that all in the supply chains right now.
It's interesting. It's hard for me to say, but I want to say something about it's the United States 100 years ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Dom, do you think so?
Yeah, I do, Mike. I think one of the things that we don't take advantage of right now, many companies have people of their own in China working their supply chain issues. They're well informed. They're in contact with a level of Chinese society that the government typically is not. And there's a benefit to it. I can give you one that goes with the COVID pandemic. Some of us formed a consortium of companies and universities when COVID-19 first was identified. And you may recall personal protective equipment and other things were hard to find, in short supply and unavailable. And we found a person who actually worked for Lockheed in China, and he was able to find 1 million N95 masks, which we brought from China mainly to New York City when they were having the worst part of the outbreak there. There was no difficulty in doing that. The Chinese were helpful. Lockheed, of course, was helpful too. They didn't look for a headline, they looked for a result. And I think the Chinese are very pragmatic in that way. And our business people tend to be too. It's only when we get the political dimension involved that we get distracted in other ways.
And that you raise a very good point about some of the positive things that happened that us journalists don't make into headline stories, or maybe you don't even know about, whereas a lot of the other issues that do get the headlines. But I'd like to put this to all of you. Have you been disappointed in the Chinese response to COVID? That here was really something that's a global health issue, and their secretive nature, their hesitation or just unwillingness or stonewalling, whatever phrase you choose to use in terms of the investigation. I mean, wasn't this a perfect opportunity for China to show that it could be play on the international stage in a responsible way? And in your view, have they failed that challenge?
I think so. And it's a problem not for the United States, it is, but it's also for China also. They should have done more.
Yeah, I think always remember the first consideration is their internal stability. So they will be driven by that in ways that don't look obvious from the outside. But yes, I think they missed an opportunity. But this is part of what a different kind of China looks like. And I'm not entirely sure that at least some of their leadership didn't feel like they didn't have to. That for whatever reason, they think they were mirroring us, where we dictated the norms of the world. And that's not the way it worked. It certainly never felt that way from the United States. But I think that to some degree they thought, what is it that, I forget what it's called, tiger diplomacy or something like that.
Wolf warrior diplomacy, I believe.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a rather bizarre thing, and they're still feeling their way out through it.
So we have a few minutes left here of the panel discussion, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So to everyone in our audience, please feel free to write in your questions, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. So perhaps in our final few minutes, a question that I'd love for all of you to weigh in on, and that is the evolution of human intelligence versus electronic technological signals intelligence, where the technology keeps getting better and better, and you can collect more and more electronically or through technology. And the flip side, of course, is human intelligence gets harder and harder because foreign governments are better and better at using that technology as well to surveil and to prevent methods of human intelligence that might have been used in the past. So as we seem to be at somewhat of an inflection point about how we go forward and define our intelligence community, could you talk a little bit about that, the tension there between electronic and human intelligence?
So I would make one point. It's mostly human intelligence, not human intelligence, but open source. Okay, I wanted to say something about open source because I think it will be more and more and more pertinent. I think, what do you think about that, Dom and Stephanie?
Well, Mike, you'll remember that Stephanie and I were in charge of the open source activities for quite a while when we were at CIA. And it was interesting because we took George Tenet out to the open source people at one point, and they explained to him what was going on in the pharmaceutical industry and the biotechnology areas in China. And the thing that made me happiest that day was my colleague, the deputy director for operations, said, "My God, we've spent millions trying to do that." And this former graduate student from Harvard did it in 3 months. So open source, I think, will be very helpful to us, particularly with all the additional information that feeds in now as open source. At the end of the day, however, human intelligence, I think, is at the core because we're dealing with the way people behave. That's not the way electrons behave. They obey the laws of physics. The people have emotions, they have histories, they have families. And without some knowledge of that, you're going to be hard pressed to predict how they might behave in a time of crisis. So I think there's no substitute for human intelligence, obviously augmented by electronic records and others, but how they're going to act is something I think you only get out of knowledge of the people.
Yeah, so to General Hayden's point, yes, open source is incredibly valuable, and we can do more with it, although we have some privacy and civil liberty things to work through, particularly given that the most abundant source of it is geometrically free. And so it's very hard to know when you're dealing with US person or not. So there's a lot of challenges there. And I also agree with Don in that you cannot get to the gold standard often in intelligence. We can give them observations, policymakers observations, but they want to know intent and they want to know motivation. So intent, where's this going? Motivation, what can I do? What are my levers to change what looks like the direction of movement? And that requires more than technical observations. And as I said when I was talking to you earlier, SIGINT is terrific. People don't usually, as in the movie, sit down and explain why they did everything and what they're about to do. That's not necessarily what you will intercept. And that takes humans, either a source or humans analyzing things over time to really provide those key question answers.
Right, and Stephanie, let me just follow on that. So, as we talked about SIGINT or human intelligence or open source, but you've made the point about the analysts, and that often, I can imagine a time back during the Cold War when trying to get a shred of information was the real challenge. And now you can certainly see times when it might be that people are drowning in information, but it's trying to make sense of that. Could you talk about the challenges this posed for analysts to synthesize this and get to what's important and throw out what's not so important?
Yeah, and you just got the second part of the challenge. So it's not only the immense volume to keep up with, but it's also sorting out that which is misleading, incomplete. And third, it's making sure that your own biases don't creep into the way you look at the data. As I got into the P. Diddy position, the thing that struck me most was that analysis, the assessments and the reports, is the distilled product of everything else we do. I spent my career mostly as a collector on the collection side in a number of disciplines, but it's really down to those analysts, how it's distilled and presented. So yeah, they've got immense challenges. And we hope that AI and machine learning and things associated with it will help us. And it certainly will help with triaging and alerting and tipping. We'll have to work through making sure it's explainable. Now I'm getting too geeky. And that you can associate it with a confidence level, which is really important. So yeah, I think analysts, they've always been our critical choke point because there's only so much gray matter that you can put on, for all this huge funnel of information, it goes through those analysts to get to our customers. So
it's very interesting. I was there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years at NSA, and 1, 2, 3, 4 CIA. Okay, and I was just saying I like them both. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
nobody could. You've had it. You've seen it from the top in both places. So this looks like the perfect place to break and turn and pivot to our questions. So Laura Nelson, Laura, I've got some written questions, but I know you've also been taking in some questions. Would you like to jump in and offer some questions? You're muted, Laura.
I'm sorry, I turned off my video, but not my mute. So sure. So let's start with, we have quite a few questions that came into the chat. So the first would be, How can the agency's mission, or we could say the IC's mission, evolve to meet today's domestic terrorism challenges within mission and legal constraints?
It's very hard.
Yeah. I think one answer is the having experienced it working on both sides at two agencies, we were able to work out with our friends at Fort Meade ways of getting help from them or helping them on domestic questions. But it took a lot of work, a lot of paper, and a lot of preparation for the questions that might follow. We need to have a more flexible way of doing that.
Let me
Yeah.
just pick up in a question format. So this Saturday, the 18th, we've got what looks like a big rally, or a rally at least in Washington among far right groups. Fencing is going up around the Capitol. What is legitimate for law enforcement? I know it's a law enforcement more than an intelligence community question, but what should the U.S. government, law enforcement be doing right now in terms of monitoring that doesn't get into violating civil liberties, but also will keep us safe on Saturday?
I go back to the Boston Marathon thing, which the fundamental question that we're asking ourselves is, how intrusive do you want your law enforcement or intelligence organizations to be? And keep us safe, it's not 100%, because that is a police state. So we will always be having this conversation as a people. And what the intelligence community can and should do is pursue transparency wherever possible. There were things that were done in the wake of 9/11 and the CT fight. Again, it's a little geeky, but Section 215 comes to mind. You know, there were things that would have been perfectly explainable at the time and would have been a lot less like some big secret revealed afterwards in the wake of Snowden if we had practiced more transparency. So I think that is our only way. That is our system. And we're going to have to approach this. It will take us far longer than people think we should, because when we move fast, we make mistakes. We do things that we regret in hindsight.
It's very interesting for me on Twitter. Every day there's something going on for me about you did this, you did this, you did this, and so on. You know, it's part of our solution, or not our solution, but I accept that. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Laura, did you want to? You're muted again.
I'll just keep it unmuted. I'm sorry. I'll keep going. I have a lot of questions here. So the hard problems, China, North Korea, Iran, don't seem to have gotten easier. Can add Russia to that. Is that just how it's going to be in the future? They're still, they're still going to be pervasive threats to us.
Yes. The thing I missed the least about my former position is waking up several times in the middle of every night, listening to the news and wondering what stupid thing has the world done to itself in the last couple of hours that we're going to deal with tomorrow. Until human nature changes, I'm not sure that we don't get to stand down from the ramparts, unfortunately. We can choose how we man those ramparts.
I think Stephanie's making a great point. We cannot have expectations of behaviors in other countries that will match what we would do. And we spend far too little time as a society trying to understand that. We don't educate people these days to think about that. But different cultures approach hard problems in different ways. And we need to change our behavior to accommodate that as well.
Okay. So this is going to go back to Afghanistan. I'm going to kind of combine two questions here. So the first is how much cooperation can we expect from the intelligence communities of the countries surrounding Afghanistan to help us monitor what happens there going forward? And then how do we prepare for the near-term intelligence needs in that area?
I think it's a real problem. Okay. Pakistan was not a friend. Okay, and I'm sorry, it'll be hard for us.
I think we need to earn every criticism we've ever had as an intelligence community, being the skeptics and the cynics in the room. It will be called for. So, and you know, you need to look at, in a sense, quite pragmatically, where do their interests lie, and where can you align interests? And I suspect it's not going to be an extensive set.
Yeah, and to add a point to what Stephanie just said, Pakistan often viewed Afghanistan as part of its region of interest as in its competition with India. And they paid much more attention to that than their relationship with the United States. I felt like, in effect, they were robbing us to secure their future in many cases rather than helping us. And you've even seen in the press recently that an awful lot of the Taliban have been living in Pakistan in recent years in readiness to come back as they just have.
Okay. Well, I'm going to continue with another Afghanistan question since we're on that path right now. In Afghanistan, the U.S. legacy seems to be quite mixed, but U.S. forces, including clandestine, will be remembered as defending some basic human rights, including especially the rights of women as equal human beings and as contributors into all elements of endeavor. Do you believe the intelligence community in the future can take a more definitive role in defending human rights around the world?
I think we can conduct ourselves in accordance with our values. It's a little hard to stand up if you're a clandestine presence, to stand up for opposition rights publicly. You can certainly engage with your counterparts, but you're going to have to, I mean, we can talk at people a lot. It's whether or not you can come at it in a way that they will listen and see the long-term benefit. And always, we should conduct ourselves in accordance with our values.
Laura, can I toss out a question that was written in advance here?
Of course.
One of our members of our audience writes, what sources, printed or otherwise, do you recommend for keeping up with timely intelligence information? You know, newsletters, books, podcasts. What do you guys like to read or watch?
I'll leap on that. Trained through years of reading great analytic reports by the intelligence community to at the Analysts, to look for succinct writing that doesn't put the thumb on the scale, or that you can understand, that does a good job of sourcing. So I read, you know, the major newspapers because I understand the sourcing and the views, and they write well. I listen to NPR. I've always been a big listener. I listen to podcasts. It's still a hangover from when I had to wake up all the time in the middle of the night worrying about things. That was the way I put myself back to sleep.
Which ones? Can you tell us which podcast?
Well, my guilty pleasure is cyber law because Stuart Baker's funny. and they do a good job of arguing the different viewpoints and keeping up with cyber. I also, I track a lot of cyber stuff, so I listen to Screaming in the Cloud, also funny. I listen to I'm trying to think of, I listen to a lot of things to break my mind, so away from serious things. So we're going to skip over that. And yeah, I guess let's leave. And oh, last thing I would say, and this isn't widely available, but the intelligence community highlights that come out. It's a great way to keep up with world news, because obviously most of our news sources are focused, US centric or external or internally. So BBC, because it's in English and it's worldwide, and the Intel community highlights. So sorry. And somebody else was trying to speak.
Don?
Good list. I would add a publication to it. The Economist is often very good at taking a view of the US relationship with other countries in the world. And it's written from a different perspective than our domestic publications. With regard to what Stephanie brought up, all of the things she mentioned are useful sources and can be. What you really have to ask is it intelligence, or is it just simply a cultural reinforcement that they provide us? And typically, I don't think a lot of our publications or broadcast media get to the people who might be our adversaries in a way that gives any clues to their thinking.
Yeah, I have the same problem, and it's a problem for me because it's hard for me to read, okay? But I do it every day, and I think what you have said is absolutely important.
I'll just, because it's my job to try to keep up on this stuff, I'll mention a few things that I find, very, whether you agree or disagree is not the point, just they're well-informed writing about the intelligence community. The Cipher Brief, which is at thecipherbrief.com online, has a lot of former intelligence people writing about issues of the day. Your former colleague, Mike Myre, has a podcast called Intelligence Matters, where he talks to some really interesting people. Many former intelligence people will have a 30, 40-minute podcast that comes out regularly. It's very good. Spy Talk is a newsletter that comes out and has some very interesting reporting as well. So I'll just toss those out there as publications that maybe not widely known, but provide really good information about the intelligence community.
And if you want to go, there's a podcast, The Iron Butterfly, which talks about women in intelligence and their careers, and interviewed a great number of current officers. So it's interesting. Last thing I'll say is that, when friends and family say, "Have you heard the following?" the first thing I ask is, "What's the source? Where did it come from? And have you sort of triangulated so that you could hear the same issue from a different couple of viewpoints?" So my family loves me.
All right. So Greg, do you want me to take another one?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Laura.
So this one is, do our guests have any thoughts regarding Havana syndrome? Who may be responsible, and is enough being done to remedy or counter it?
It needs to be addressed because it's having a significant impact on officers in the field and what they perceive as the threats or are experiencing as threat impacts and effects. It is still a mystery. It is not, I would certainly say, over the last year, it is not being ignored. It is being vigorously pursued. That said, it is still a mystery. Most well known, they went to the National Science Foundation. So I mean, they're polling outside experts as much as they can, and they certainly have a wide open viewpoint. But this is a huge priority for Director Burns at CIA.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I have another question, and this one just came in. It was actually good because it switches a little bit to cyber. a bit. The D&I was created out of necessity. Some new positions in the executive branch have been created to deal with cybersecurity. Are they improving the situation? And what can you say about the rules of engagement?
Well, I
I'd
can
say
say,
it's going to be how strong Chris Inglis is, would be the answer I would give. I mean, I think appointing him to a senior position is a very good idea, given his background and proven capabilities. What I don't know is what authorities go with that position, how it will interface both with the telecommunications industry, publications of various kinds online, and the intelligence community. It's a mystery to me how he will be able to navigate without a clear view of what authorities he's being given.
that's exactly correct. I was watching it, and one condition was this: who's in charge? And I don't know. I don't know.
I'm going to come at it a little bit more hopefully. The team that's in there now is a team of all-stars. We've always had very good people, but these are serious choices and serious people. I would bring in a little bit something from my experience post-work in the corporate world. The CMMC provisions and things associated with it, the requirements to have a federal contract that are being put in place, and they just keep layering these things up. I mean, we started with pretty simple requirements, but it is getting to where companies now every company I'm associated with is having to put significant funds into hardening their systems. I'm on a board where we have a cyber committee, not just a topic that's addressed in passing at a board meeting, but a full committee dedicated to how we are going to survive this, along with the peak in ransomware and the threats associated with it. I do think for the first time that I can see, it's not just the government talking about the threats and trying to deal with them, but a serious engagement on the corporate side. And as the cyber conundrum has always been, 75 to 90%, however you want to measure it, of the vulnerable surface is not in government hands, but is in private sector hands. So it's necessary that we turn the corner in the private sector's response, and I think it's happening.
Let me pick up on that with a related question that was sent in advance. It's like sort of how do we teach younger students, K through 12, in terms of thinking about misinformation, disinformation, just basic cyber security, to create a nation that is aware of these things and knows how to do at least the basics right, and can sort of see through misinformation and disinformation.
Well, so far,
I think it's, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry, I just say, so far, we didn't do a good job. Okay, not at all. Go ahead, John.
Well, I would say exactly the same thing. And what I would argue is that we need a new approach to teaching, starting in primary education and on into secondary and beyond. But the people who are trying to do the teaching, the rules under which they do it are not conducive to the kind of modern problem that you bring up. And it's good that we're getting kids back in the classroom. It's not good that the things that are going to be taught haven't changed in the direction you're talking about.
I know, I'll just toss out that one of your former colleagues, General Keith Alexander, is now involved in a program in Florida, I think Cyber Florida, which is trying to teach this as a regular class to schools that want it and has created a program. But do you think something like that can be effective on more than just a limited basis, in a few schools where it's taught, but sort of a national level where kids, I've got 3 kids and they're pretty savvy on a lot of stuff. They're just digital natives. And so they can pick up on a lot of stuff. But in other ways, I see them as not understanding misinformation, disinformation. Is there a way to do it? Obviously, it's not the IC's job, but is there a way through education that we can do it?
Well, it seems to me that we have to find a way to do it. And part of it is to illustrate to kids the downside of some of their behaviors and some of their thinking. That's a hard thing for teachers to do. They generally try to stick to focusing on the upside of behavior. But here are the dangers all around us, and nobody's paying attention to that in terms of their daily lives. And they're posting things, they're storing things electronically in ways that make them exceedingly vulnerable. And we have to change that thinking.
In the former Soviet Union, there were 2 newspapers, Pravda, which means truth, and Izvestia, which means news. And there was, of course, the old saying that there is no truth in news and there is no news in truth. So Soviet citizens got it. You didn't believe what the government tells you, but that can also create a very cynical population. The Russian vaccine, seems for COVID seems to be, perhaps decent, maybe not great, but decent. They're having a real hard time convincing the population that they're telling the truth, that you develop a cynical population if they think everything is intentionally misleading information. And we've certainly seen the problem with that. So how, are you seeing any positive things? Was the 2016 and the 2020, were these wake-up calls, or is this just a sign of a very difficult future we're going to have?
So I was saying, I'll do Breitbart. Every once in a while, I'll do Breitbart, okay? And it's awful. And yet it continues and continues and continues. What are we going to do about things about that?
I'm going to go for some hopefulness. All the discussion about bias and understanding inherent bias that we all have, and I'm not applying this to any one particular topic. As I went through my career, I learned to seek out opinions that were different than my own. I knew what I thought, and I was going to make the best possible decision based on what I know. But I used to look for things that were contrary, that would force me to think outside my comfort zone. The best deputy I ever had irritated the heck out of me, and was the best deputy I ever had because of that. What General Hayden does, you should go look at things that you don't agree with. Because we cannot, here's the flip side. Remember when we went into Iraq and we all condemned how we pushed the Sunnis out of government and gave them nowhere to go? And 5-6 years later, we have ISIL. You cannot ignore a large part of your population. You have to figure out a way to listen to them on both sides of the spectrum. It just pretending like it's not there is not going to get us anywhere. So I'm hoping that with all the focus on bias, we can turn that to thinking about how we approach understanding things ourselves.
So
Laura?
Greg, I have another
ahead.
question. This is pivoting to China. And this has to do with that, Chinese party members, investors have recognized the opportunity that open U.S. economy and society presents, sending their kids to the U.S. schools, investing heavily in our industries. Do you believe this openness poses a security risk going forward? And how can the IC contribute to a discussion of security risks as Chinese become investors in more than U.S. treasuries in the future?
It seems to me that no one ever charged or asked the intelligence community for opinions about specific investments. That was kind of beyond the pale for intelligence officers and organizations. whether we need to embed the community in the civilian economy and the financial decisions made there, it is, to me, a very difficult question, unless you're defending against some sort of financial attack that might be mounted. So I think you've raised a good question, no doubt. But I think the authorities and concerns that might be stirred will merit an awful lot of homework before you get involved in that discussion.
When we saw the Colonial Pipeline attack this year, it certainly set off a lot of alarm bells. I mean, I think people who've been following this knew this kind of stuff was happening, but this really, because of the impact that it had. Could you talk a little bit about the need for the intelligence community to work with private companies for this, or also have the public be aware, especially if it, again, maybe getting back a little bit to disinformation or misinformation. If the public does, if the intelligence community knows that there's a certain stream of disinformation, do they need to share that with the public? If they see certain companies at risk or feel they're at risk, doesn't there need to be greater cooperation between the companies and the intelligence community than we've seen in the past? It's not something that the intelligence community can keep to itself.
I think so, but it's hard, okay? Because we're doing different things, but now we have to do something more important, okay? So I think, yes, indeed, we have to be open, more open than before.
Yeah, I think the best we can do is to reveal source to the extent that we have insight to that. Because otherwise you end up in the problem of where Facebook and Google are now, of being an arbiter of what is disinformation or not. And that is not a healthy place, I think, for an intelligence, an organization with secrets, which we will always have necessarily to be. So.
And just a quick follow-up on that, what CISA was trying to do during the election last year was saying, okay, we're seeing this threat that seems to be an Iranian operation. Yes, the Russians are trying to do some things, but they seem to be on a much smaller scale than 2016. How helpful is that? Or how much does it just contribute to thinking there's conspiracies everywhere?
Well, if it's what we were saying, we're obligated to say it. So that's not a choice that we get to make. How open we can be, again, the lean should be toward transparency where you possibly can, and the messenger should not necessarily be, I mean, the debate rapidly goes to the policy side of the table. So. Yeah.
So we're down to 3 minutes. And so there's one quick question about the intelligence highlights. Stephanie, somebody wants to know where they can find those. I don't know if they're available to the general public. So that's a quick answer. You could do that.
The case, but I'm sure that if you can assemble a similar thing, by getting the summary clips, and I'd have to think about how to do that.
Okay. And the last thing I think we should just ask is if there was one thing, you spent many years as leaders in intelligence, if there was one thing that you could do differently given the chance.
The hard part's keeping it to one.
Yeah, it would seem to me that you could reflect on the experience that the three of us have had. I still remember when Mike was the first PDD-NI, and he came to the different agencies to explain what a light touch it would be. It would be a coordination mechanism and so on. As his successor, what I found were people who had been pulled from various places like the community management staff They'd been promoted, so you couldn't send them away very quickly. And a consequence was that they wanted to manage more. They weren't a light touch. And the PDDNI job evolved to be more like a chief operating officer, given the fact that the DNI was typically with the policy community all the time. So we formed things like the deputy XCOM. So when the principals got together, they would know what the issue was that they were there to discuss. And so there's going to have to be constant evolution. But at some point, you have to ask, does the DNI have command of the intelligence community and the responsibility that goes with command, or whether it's still a coordination mechanism? And depending where you sit in the community, you will possibly answer that quite differently.
I still think it works as a light touch influence thing if you have people knowledgeable in the community, so they know what roles to touch on. They have relationships that you can utilize to do that. The problem with it being anything else is Congress, right? And if you wanted to order, so make it so for something from the P. Diddy seat or the DNI seat, you got another partner out there. And every one of your agencies at any moment could be on the Hill and telling the tale of woe about how this ridiculous edict came down from the DNI, and it's bureaucratic, and to some extent, in some place it will be, because you're trying to balance the most good. A few people won't like something. So yeah, I guess I'd still come down on the side of influence and the hard road that we all hoed in trying to make that work.
Yeah, yes, indeed. I remember that a lot.
Yeah.
But I think also the DNI, I'm glad for that, because when I was NSA, I could do many things now that the DNI had to do. And
Yeah.
that was really good.
In many cases, we became both the challenger of the intelligence community, challenging them to be everything that they could be, and the shield. So in the wake of a lot of very bad things, when the spotlight moved to the DNI, and at least the agencies had someone to share it with, I think that did a lot to building up our esprit de corps through the community. So
good point. Yeah, I think the real question now is to look at all of the capabilities that are available to the DNI and ask, are we now efficiently managing and funding them? Should we do things to consolidate some of them? Are there things that have become obsolete in the time since the Second World War in terms of organization and management? And that's going to take someone who comes with a suit of armor, ready to deal with all the congressional and other interests that Stephanie just brought up, because every small entity within the community has a friend on the Hill. We know that.
oh yeah.
So I'd just like to jump in here and say thank you to all our panelists who've given us such a great discussion today. I've certainly been fascinating for me. I hope for our audience as well. And Laura, I'll toss it over to you.
Sure. Before I close, I wanted to point just to follow up on the K through 12 conversation as a reminder to all of our participants and our guests today. The focus of the National Cryptologic Foundation is on K through 12 education, specifically on cybersecurity education, and we already have some programs in place to get some curriculum in the hands of teachers. And any help that any of you can do in promoting that for us and helping us to get it across the nation would be greatly appreciated. Beyond just the curriculum, we do cyber chats, we do a lot of activities for that. So anyway, thank you all. So in closing, thank you, Greg, for moderating another fantastic conversation. Thank you, Mike, Don, and Stephanie for joining today and participating in the 25th anniversary program. Thank you to our supporting donors, Dell Technologies, GIBA, and Tower Federal Credit Union. As a reminder, the NCF is a 5013C nonprofit organization. It is members and donors like you that help us schedule important programs like today's. If you are currently not a member, go to www.cryptologicfoundation.org and become one today. To donate, please contact me at the email or phone number listed on the screen. Thank you all for joining us. That concludes our program.